I live in a cool climate, Canada actually, and I am able to eat locally, eat seasonally year round. Often it's actually my own homegrown food that I'm eating year round. So I'm going to tell you in this video exactly how I do it and how you can do it too. Hey, if you haven't met me before, I'm Nadia, and today I'm going to talk about eating seasonally in the winter. I think, we all understand how eating seasonally in the summer works, right? I mean, there's farmers markets, there's, if you have a garden, if you have like a patio or a balcony or like an actual garden in your backyard or front yard, that's kind of obvious. That's how you would eat seasonally at those times of the year. But you can totally be eating seasonally year round, even if you live in a cold climate. So I told you I live in Canada, and yet I'm able to eat seasonally, eat locally year round. So in this video, I want to walk through exactly how that works, exactly how I do that. So I'm going to break this down into two different categories. The first category is around like eating fresh food. So eating food that is like you just picked it in the winter, and there's plenty of ways that you can do that in the winter. The other category is preserving food. So I want to talk a little bit about how you can eat seasonally with preserved food. Now, there's some nuances to that, and some people might disagree that preserved food isn't seasonal, but I'll let you be the judge of that. But I'll talk to you about how that works, about how you can have preserved food and kind of incorporate that into your seasonal diet. But there's plenty of fresh options too. So those are the two main categories, and I'm going to talk about the different ways within those categories that you can try to incorporate into a seasonal diet. I do a lot of these right now. I do some of them from the fresh category, some of them from the preserved category, and there are definitely pros and cons to all of them. So I'm going to tell you which ones are my favorite, and then you can decide which ones maybe you want to start to incorporate yourself as well. First, let's talk about growing your own food. So you might think that it's snowing outside, or, we don't even have to think winter, right? Like really any time beyond the natural period where you would stop growing food outside, like when your frost hits. So if you're a gardener, you probably know about your first and last frost date. If you're not a gardener, just think about like, when does it start to get cold out, and when do a lot of the plants start dying? When do the leaves start turning red and yellow, and things start dying back? Or you can even think of it as like, when do farmers markets close for the season? That's really the time I would say that you need to switch over into this kind of new way of eating seasonally. Not new, but different way of eating seasonally. So I say winter, but really it's like fall, winter, early spring. Like that whole category, depending on where you live, could be included in this bucket. So when we're talking about eating fresh food in the winter and the cooler weather, the first way that you can do that is sprouting. And this is a really good option for people who maybe haven't had a garden before, or maybe they don't have a place to grow their own food, or they just want something pretty simple to start with. Sprouting is a really good option, one that I love to use in the cooler weather. I don't sprout much actually in the summer, but when it's colder out, I bring out my sprouting equipment, which I have, I'll show you, and that is what I do that's one of the ways that I get my fresh greens or fresh food into my diet in the winter. And the cool thing about sprouting is that within like a week, you can have sprouts. So you take the seeds that are just in a bag, dormant, and you add some water to it, you do your whole process, and then within about a week, maybe it could be like a week and a half, you will have fresh sprouts, and you can keep doing this all winter long. So if you don't have a lot of locally available produce around you, this is a really good way to get some fresh local food into your diet. So really, really good option, I think, especially for people who are getting into this winter seasonal diet. This is a nice one to start with. The second option of having your own fresh food available to you is growing near a sunny window. So if you have like a south-facing window for sure in your house, or just an area of your house that gets pretty good sunlight, that's a really good candidate for you to be able to grow like herbs, or maybe even like some fresh greens. You probably want a little bit more sunlight than a sunny window, unless you live in the south, to be able to grow like something from seed, like lettuce from seed, for example, like that from a sunny window. The sun just isn't as strong in the winter, but you can definitely have herbs and have access to fresh herbs just with a sunny window. So that's a nice way to get access to some fresh ingredients, fresh flavors in the middle of the winter. And if you don't have access to a sunny window, or you want to take it a step further, you can use lights. So you can set up like lights in your house. You can buy grow lights, or you can just buy like there's ways that you can do this DIY. But you essentially you set up like a stand. You have lights above the plants, and then you have you can be growing things from seed in there. A lot of gardeners like to start their own plants from seed indoors in the winter using grow lights. So this is a nice way that you can actually be growing like lettuce. I do this with meslin greens, you know, like the baby greens that you buy in bags or bins or whatever at the grocery store. Those ones are actually really accessible to be able to grow indoors yourself under lights in the winter. So I love this option. It's not, you can't grow everything this way certainly, but there are definitely some plants that work really well with this option. And if you have grow lights, or if you're willing to invest in some grow lights and set up a little station in your house, you can have you can actually pretty easily expand your fresh produce availability in the winter. So that's another way that you can eat seasonally in the winter. And then on that same realm of lights, there's also like Aeroponics or Hydroponics. I did a video with a girl who actually, she had a tower garden, and we talked all about it. So I'll have a video, a link to that video in the description below. But you can get more elaborate with your light system and buy an actual kit. Now, with these kits, you're not growing in soil. Like with the grow lights, you're going to be growing in soil, very similar to how you'd be growing outside. With aeroponics or hydroponics, you're not using soil. So it's a different way to grow, and it's like a different, you have to have, understand how that works. But it's a really good option if maybe you don't have anywhere outdoors to grow. Like if you live in an apartment or a condo, or you're renting and you just don't have any place to grow, I really like this option. On the other hand though, I think if you have access to an outdoor garden, it's not necessarily my favorite choice, because it's just a different way of growing that you're going to have to learn now. And there is actually a way that you can, which I'll talk about in a second, be able to grow outdoors in the winter. But aeroponics, hydroponics, anything like that are very doable options, and something that you might want to consider if you want to have access to fresh food in the winter. Now, again, just like growing in soil under lights, you don't have access to all the food. Like you can't necessarily grow tomatoes. Like I know you can get a little bit, but you're not going to get like beefsteak tomatoes necessarily from a lot of those kinds of kits. But you can definitely get herbs, you can get greens. There's a whole bunch of things that you can be getting from a kit like that if you want to expand your winter growing, and how you can absolutely be eating a little bit more seasonally in the winter. All right, and then my favorite in this category of growing your own food, so having access to fresh food in the winter, and this is just the one category, right? We have the other category still to talk about. But in this category, my absolute favorite way to eat seasonally in the winter is growing my own food outside. Now, you might think that, didn't you just talk about the fact that you can't grow outside, or this gardening season's over, farmers markets are over? Yes. And a lot of people, certainly myself, I thought when like the garden centers closed off and farmers markets closed and plants were dying outside, that was the end of the gardening season, right? That's logical. But as I started getting more and more involved in gardening, and I started learning more and, just digging into it a little bit more, I realized that there's absolutely ways that you can be extending your growing season outdoors. So you can be using things like cold frames, you can set up like hoops, you can obviously do a greenhouse, but you don't need a greenhouse for this. There are lots of ways, like very accessible ways, for you to be expanding your garden in the winter and be getting access to fresh food from your garden in the middle of the winter. So this is a really fascinating topic that as soon as I started reading about more, I was so excited about, and I got really, really into it. And it's almost my favorite way to grow food now, just because it's so fascinating and it's so different from how everyone else is growing food, right? Like not everyone, but like the majority of people that you hear about that have gardens, they're not doing this. So this was a really cool revelation for me, I guess, when I found out about it, how you can do this, like not with a greenhouse, you can do this other ways as well. And it is absolutely my favorite way to be eating seasonally in the winter, because it's the same concept that I'm using in my summer growing. I'm just, switching things around a little bit, but I'm still growing in that same area of my garden, in that same raised bed, just with different types of plants and different types of covers and things like that. So this is a really cool one. I'm going to be talking a lot more about this in the next couple of weeks. So if you're not already subscribed and you want to hear more about growing outdoors in the winter, then you might want to subscribe to my channel, and then you'll hear all about those videos. But I'll get more into this topic later, but I really, really like this one. Now, I still do sprouting. I still love sprouting. I still sometimes grow indoors under lights, but my favorite is growing outdoors in nature in the winter. I think it's so cool. Okay, so we talked about growing fresh food. There's also the option to be preserving your own food. And this is the way that I kind of just assumed that you would have to do if you wanted to eat seasonally or eat locally grown food or homegrown food throughout the winter. This is just like what, I don't know, I just was ingrained in my mind before I learned all about those other options. But, there's definitely still merit to preserving your own food. And the reason is that not everything grows well in the winter. Like if you wanted, let's say, peaches or plums or something like that, those are not, you can't necessarily just get those in the winter by doing some winter gardening techniques. There's still like nature's kind of laws that you have to follow. So if you want to be eating some of those foods that come in the summer, like tomatoes or like I said, lots of different types of fruits that are available in the summer, then you're going to want to preserve them. And, some people might not think that this is eating seasonally when you're preserving food. I think that in many of the ways that I'm going to talk about, it is still a valid seasonal option, especially with some of the first, at least the first one that I'm about to talk about. I think that this is still a really valid option for eating seasonally. So I want to bring them up to you, and then you can make that call for yourself. The first thing for preserving food that I want to mention is you can store things in like a pantry, or if you have a cold cellar. I know not a lot of us have a cold cellar, but if you did have one, you could be preserving food in a cold cellar. So let's put the cold cellar aside for a second, because I would imagine that not everyone watching this video has one. But it's essentially like a cold place in your house. It could be an unfinished basement, an unfinished room that is not heated, and usually is just it's like just cement walls, ideally with a vent. So there's like some setup you have to do for that. So that's one way that obviously you can preserve a lot of food, and it just stays fresh in there. It's kind of like a fridge. It acts like a fridge, but there's some nuances to it that make it able to preserve food potentially over the whole winter. But aside from that, the pantry is a really good option for things like garlic and onions and squash, like winter squash, pumpkins, things like that. So those are all I look at as seasonal foods in the winter. So with garlic, I see that even though you harvest it, garlic is actually harvested in the summer. You can be eating garlic year round, and you just store it in your pantry. As long as it was dried properly, you can store it absolutely throughout the winter. Onions can be stored long for as well, not quite as long as garlic, but winter squash, so your butternut squash, acorn squash, spaghetti squash, all those fun squashes, those can all be stored in the pantry, and you can be eating them throughout the winter. So that's a really, I don't think anyone would argue that this way of preserving food is not seasonal, because I absolutely think that's a seasonal way of eating. And it's one that I think if you have a garden, or if you like to buy from local farms or local farmers markets, stocking up on some of these pantry items and just keeping them in your kitchen is a really nice way to extend that season and be able to take some of that locally grown food and be able to eat it throughout the winter. The next category in this preserving food section is fermenting. And I've done some videos on fermenting food before, and I love fermenting food. I think it's so much fun. It's kind of like pickling, but you're not cooking the ingredients, and in fact, you're actually getting some probiotics from the vegetables that you might not have otherwise got if you were just eating them fresh. So fermenting is a really cool way to do it. There's some really good vegetables that you can get started with if you are new to fermenting. I have some videos on that, which I'll also link down in the description if you want to get started on fermenting. And this is a cool way also of extending your harvest and being able to eat some of your own locally grown food, homegrown food or locally grown food, and extending that into the winter. This is really nice. You're not cooking it, so you're not destroying some of the enzymes, the vitamins and minerals that might otherwise get destroyed when you cook food. The food is still raw. It's just being preserved in a brine, which is really cool. All right, next up in this category, I have a couple more. Next up in this category is dehydrating. So drying your food. And dehydrating is probably one of my favorite. I have a few in this category that I really like. I actually like all the three that we've talked about so far. There's really only one in this category. I don't do much. But I love dehydrating food. I have a dehydrator. You can do it in the oven. It's hard. It's easier if you have a dehydrator for this. So obviously if you don't have a dehydrator, this wouldn't be a great option. But if you do have one, it's a nice way to preserve your food, and you can preserve like a lot of fruits and vegetables and herbs and nuts and seeds and all sorts of stuff. But my favorites that I like to do in this is fruits. So if I get like a bushel of something from a farm, let's say plums or apricots or apples for sure, I like to dehydrate them, and then they can just be little snacks. Like I will throw them in my kids' lunches, and then they have access to this locally grown food that I know where it came from. I know the ingredients that went into it. It's not being shipped from, the other side of the world, and I'm still able to eat some of that summer harvest in the winters. I actually had an interview in my last video with a health coach. She has some raw food cookbooks. She mentioned the number, I don't recall if it's 113 or 118 Fahrenheit. You can correct me in the description or the comments down below if you'd like. But when you dehydrate something and you keep the temperature really low, so below that 118 or whatever it is, it actually preserves the enzymes in the food and it stays raw. So that's a really nice way to kind of keep the nutritional value of the food that you're preserving. And oftentimes when you buy dehydrated food or dried food from the grocery store, it's not dried at such a low level. They dry it at higher levels, and then you're losing some of that nutritional content. So by drying it yourself, you're not only eating your own homegrown or locally grown food, but you also potentially are getting more enzymes and more nutrition from that exact same food. So that's really cool. I love this option. You can do so much with a dehydrator if you get into it. There's like a whole world of things that you can learn about with a dehydrator. But even just drying fruits, vegetables, I dry herbs for sure. The freshness of your own dried herbs is unlike anything that you buy in a package. It's so cool. So I love this option. I think it's a really nice way to be able to get that seasonal food in the winter as well. And then we move on to canning. So canning is, I think, the way that a lot of us think about when we think about preserving food from like a homegrown garden. You think about people like having walls of canned food, certainly back in the olden days when we didn't have access to all of this amazing food at grocery stores. We had to do that obviously ourselves. But now, a lot of people still go to canning to make like tomato sauces, salsas, jams, things like that. I mean, you can can a whole bunch of things. If you have certain types of equipment, you have a wider variety of things that you can can. But, this one is not my favorite. I actually don't do much canning at all. The odd time I might make some jam. I made Concord grape jelly before. It's so good. But, there's a lot of sugar in that, so I try not to make that too much. But, sometimes I'll can tomatoes, but not really. I actually don't use this option very much. I really like all of the other options, and I have one more after this to share with you, above canning. So this is a personal preference. I don't love, the time that it takes. It takes a long time to can. You're in the kitchen for several hours. And, I'm always scared of botulism. So it's not my favorite way, but it's absolutely a great option for people that love canning, especially if you maybe grew up with it. Maybe your parents or your grandparents did a lot of canning and that has like a sentimental value for you, then for sure. Also, if some people just love canning. So it's one for you to decide. You can obviously decide if this is a good option for you, but it is a valid way to preserve your harvest. Whether it's eating seasonally or not, I'll leave that up to you to decide. I could see some arguments against it because when you heat it at such a high heat, you're kind of destroying some of the benefits of the food that you'd be getting from it raw from some of these other methods. But, it's still a great way to eat locally grown food if you like canning. So it's an option, and if you want to get into canning, there's lots of resources online for you to learn more about this as well. And then last up in this preservation category, before I kind of summarize them all, is freezing. And freezing is actually my go-to method for things that I used to can. So I learned actually a lot from a farmer. You may know him, Elliot Coleman. I love this guy. I hope I get to meet him one day. He's so cool. He is a pioneer in the organic farming industry. He taught me a lot of what I learned about winter gardening. And he taught me, one of the things that he taught me in one of his cookbooks was that he mentioned, and I think it might have been his wife actually that wrote this part, because I don't know which of them wrote the cookbook section of this book, but they had mentioned that they like to freeze tomatoes instead of canning them. And when I learned this and I tried this for the first time, I'm like, this is awesome. I'm always doing this now. So I think if you grow tomatoes at home, you probably have a lot of them. Or if you you'll see bushels of tomatoes at the end of the season at farms or farmers markets or even some grocery stores that stock a lot of local foods. And what are you going to do with all those? There's no way that you're going to eat them all. And instead of canning them, freezing them is a really nice alternative. I also dry tomatoes, but freezing them, because what you do is you just put them in a Ziploc bag whole, and when you're ready to eat them, you take the tomato, you put it under some running water, and then the skin just comes right off and you can throw it into a dish. So it's a really cool way for like zero effort. All you're doing is sticking a tomato in a Ziploc bag to be able to eat homegrown or locally grown food in the winter. So I do this with tomatoes, I do this with greens, I do it with like okra. So freezing has a lot of really cool benefits that just in terms of like time, it doesn't take as long to do it. You can do like one at a time. If you have one tomato, for example, you can throw it in the bag versus you need a lot of tomatoes to make tomato sauce. So it's a nice option, easier and just less time consuming than some of the other options, like even pulling out your dehydrator for a couple of tomatoes or like a few leaves of kale or something like that. Throwing it in a bag or in a bin or something in your freezer is a whole lot easier. So I love this option as a preservation. And I still count that as eating seasonally in the winter because I'm not cooking the food very often. I don't really cook things before I freeze them. So I look at it as it's just, it's still intact. I didn't really change the makeup of the food at all by cooking it. It's just frozen and then I dehydrate it, or I thaw it and then I can throw it into a dish, or oftentimes if it's greens, I'll put it into a smoothie or something like that in the winter. Like I said, in my next video, I'm going to be talking more about growing your own food in the winter, so stay tuned for that. And I'd be interested to know if you are doing any of these right now, if you're preserving any of your own food, or if you're growing any of your own food in the winter, and which one is your favorite. So let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear about your experience as well. And that is it for this week, and I will see you in the next one.